Welcome back to lecture number 3 of week 2, the endocrine system. In this lecture, we are going to do a lot of talking about endocrine physiology in terms of glands, what hormones they secrete, their target cells, things like that. So let's get started here. All right, so the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, they're very close together anatomically, and they also work very close together. So here in the brain, in this region here, we have the hypothalamus right in here with that little pituitary structure hanging off the brain itself. So the brain goes about like that, and the pituitary gland kind of dips down below the brain a little bit. And remember that the pituitary is connected via a stalk, pituitary stalk, or you can call it the infundibulum here. There's two lobes. There's an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. So anterior would be towards the face. Here's the nose. The posterior would be towards the back. And just to recap from histology, so anterior has a lot of glandular tissue, so it makes and secretes its own hormones. The posterior is mainly made up of axons coming from the hypothalamus here. So those hormones are made in the hypothalamus and they travel down the axons and are here in the posterior pituitary, and then that's where they're released. So let's talk about where it all begins here. So if we're talking about hypothalamic pathways, we are talking about releasing or inhibiting hormones. And there's going to be quite a bit of memorization with a lot of these hormones, but in their paths, they have very similar names or word parts. And so that should kind of help, I hope. But essentially, some hormones that the hypothalamus will release include growth hormone releasing hormone, or GHRH, and I gave the abbreviation in here as well for all of these. Somatostatin, prolactin inhibiting hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone. And all of these releasing hormones all stimulate the anterior pituitary gland. And then the anterior pituitary will release or not release a hormone in response to each of those. And remember that hormones are receptor specific. And so they're going to match like partners in their names. So the anterior pituitary is here. So there's a close-up view. This is a portal capillary network here in the anterior pituitary. And then these are some neural axons here as well. And then all of these hormones are released here from the anterior pituitary. And the anterior pituitary makes and stores its own hormones, but they respond to hormones from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus here will release a hormone into this bloodstream or this portal system, and that will travel down here and stimulate the anterior pituitary to release a hormone in response to this hormone up here. And this is also helpful to have this portal system, because what can also happen is that this anterior pituitary can do negative feedback. So let's just say that you're getting a release of hormone here from the hypothalamus in high levels, and the anterior pituitary senses that. It can send a message back up here to the hypothalamus saying, hey, slow it down, right? Negative feedback mechanism. So that portal system here is very helpful. Here are the anterior pituitary hormones in yellow. And then I started with the hypothalamic hormones. So the hypothalamus always stimulates the anterior pituitary. So here's your partners, right? So the hypothalamus releases growth hormone releasing hormone. Well, that has to do with growth hormone, right? And the actual growth hormone is released by the anterior pituitary. Somatostatin is going to be an inhibitory hormone. So a statin is always inhibiting, and that actually inhibits growth hormone. So let's just say that the hypothalamus is releasing a bunch of growth hormone releasing hormone, and the anterior pituitary says, okay, so I'm getting signals from the body that our tissues are growing too fast. Okay, so then the anterior pituitary can release somatostatin, and that will go back in the portal system here and tell the hypothalamus to stop releasing GHRH. Prolactin inhibiting hormone inhibits the release of prolactin. That's important in non-pregnant individuals. Thyrotropin releasing hormone has to do with the thyroid. And so the anterior pituitary responds to that and releases TSH. Corticotropin releasing hormone has to do with the adrenal glands. And so the anterior pituitary will release ACTH. And then in response to gonadotropin releasing hormones, we release hormones associated with the gonads, such as LH and FSH. We're going to talk about functions of these here in just a little bit. So let's start with growth hormone. So the whole pathway starts with the hypothalamus. So if we need to make and release growth hormone, the hypothalamus starts that pathway. And so the hypothalamus releases a hormone called GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. Okay, that goes down into the anterior pituitary gland, and that stimulates the anterior pituitary to begin releasing growth hormone. Growth hormone then travels down the bloodstream to different areas of the body in terms of target tissues, and targets bone, muscle, and connective tissues to stimulate growth, usually in adolescence. So functions of growth hormone: promoting cell division and tissue growth, obviously, right? And with that comes the increased rate of protein synthesis. And then also an interesting function of growth hormone is to promote the availability of glucose. And glucose is really important in cellular function as well as nervous system function in order to give that energy needed to grow. So that's growth hormones pathway. And as we go through these, I would suggest some stuff out of the way here. This is what I would suggest you do. Okay. Let me just try to focus here. Well, it's not going to let me focus for some reason. Oh, you know why? Because I have the blurred background. Okay, that's okay. I will make another video on how to draw out those pathways. We'll go over that in a later video. Okay, so that's growth hormone. Let's go into another hypothalamic starting hormone. Okay, so somatostatin. The hypothalamus can release somatostatin, and that responds to the anterior pituitary decreasing the GH secretion. So, for example, if a individual is post-adolescence where they're not needing to grow at such a high rate anymore, then your hypothalamus can release something called somatostatin, and that tells your pituitary to stop releasing growth hormone. And then obviously it's the same targets. So your bones, your muscles, your connective tissues, things like that. And also that is just to maintain homeostasis, right? You don't want to continue growing at such a fast rate after adolescence. If you do, here are some growth abnormalities with too much or too little growth hormone. So, for example, if you have hyper, which is too much, or hypo, too little of growth hormone. So hyper secretion of growth hormone results in something called gigantism. And that's this individual right here. Here's the average size male, and here's this male. But basically that is when growth hormone never gets shut off. And so you have accelerated growth, bones, muscles, soft tissues, a lot of problems with organs at that point, because your organs don't necessarily all grow to the size that they need to be in order to accommodate such a large stature. If you have too little growth hormone, there are some types of dwarfism that can result from that. There's pituitary dwarfism, which would be a deficiency in growth hormone itself. maybe your pituitary is secreting enough growth hormone, but maybe your target cell receptors aren't responsive to the growth hormone. So that's another problem, right? Because that growth hormone leaves the pituitary, travels down the bloodstream to the bones, the muscles, and the connective tissues. And all of the cells of those structures have receptors on them for growth hormone. And if those receptors are damaged or non-functional, well, that growth hormone is not going to have any effect on those tissues. There's also, something called achondroplasia, which is a deficiency in bone growth in dwarfism folks. Hypothyroidism, that has something to do with like metabolism and growth as well. And the two different types of dwarfism are proportionate and disproportionate. So just like it sounds, proportionate would be when maybe like the head, the hands, the feet, and the organs are all proportionate to their like stature. But disproportionate would be those folks with maybe an abnormally large head or abnormally large heart or something like that, where it's not proportional to their actual stature. All right, the next one is prolactin. And so with prolactin, it is inhibited in non-pregnant individuals until an individual is pregnant and needs to start producing milk. And so the hypothalamus is constantly releasing PIH, prolactin inhibiting hormone, in a non-pregnant individual. And this tells the anterior pituitary to suppress prolactin release. And ultimately, prolactin targets the mammary glands. So in a non-pregnant individual, we're inhibiting mammary development and milk production. But in a pregnant individual, okay, pregnancy hormones, estrogen and progesterone, those two hormones are very high during pregnancy. And those actually inhibit PIH in a negative feedback mechanism. So you have estrogen and progesterone being released by the ovaries during pregnancy. And that actually negative feedbacks up to the brain and the hypothalamus and shuts off PIH. Well, if you shut off PIH, right, now you're going to start producing prolactin, right? It's going to be the opposite effect. And then mammary development and lactation can occur. And after pregnancy, you have a pretty steep downfall of estrogen and progesterone. And so prolactin may be inhibited a little bit, but there's some other mechanisms that can initiate prolactin, including like the nervous stimulation of an infant suckling on the nipple and things like that. So this isn't the only pathway of prolactin being released, but it is a major pathway. Thyroid stimulating hormones. So the hypothalamus starts by releasing thyrotropin releasing hormone. That tells the anterior pituitary to release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And that travels the bloodstream from the brain down to the thyroid gland right here and tells your thyroid to release T4 and T3. And they have very similar function. A difference would be that there's more T4 in the body than T3. Thyroxine and triiodothyronine, T4 and T3, target most bones and tissues. And they function in a lot of metabolism functions. So weight regulation, energy levels, skin temperature, skin, hair, nail growth. You probably all know somebody who has had thyroid problems and know that some of these things are compromised in those individuals. So examples, hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism. So hyperthyroidism is when your thyroid is overproductive. And so your thyroid gland is producing too much T3, T4. Now, that causes low TSH levels. And why would that be? Think about that for just a second. If you have too much T3, T4, why would your TSH levels be low? Negative feedback, right? So if you're producing a lot of T3, T4 right here, there's no reason to keep stimulating the thyroid to keep releasing more, right? So your TSH is going to shut off. Really what that is though, is a disease of the thyroid gland itself. So it's its own problem. It's releasing too much T3, T4, whether or not there's a lot of TSH coming to it or not. Nevertheless, if there's a lot of T3 and T4 being released here, your brain is going to know not to keep stimulating it. And so it's going to kind of shut off the TSH release. And so that's hyperthyroidism. Example would be Graves' disease, if you know anybody with that. Hypothyroidism is going to be the opposite. So you have not enough T3, T4 being released by the thyroid gland. And so your anterior pituitary is going to try and accommodate for that and try to stimulate it more often and in a heavier manner to try and release more, have it produce more of that T3, T4. Okay, so let's move on to another one. So adrenocorticotropic hormone starts in the hypothalamus with corticotropic releasing hormone. And then the anterior pituitary takes that signal and releases adrenocorticotropic hormone. And that targets the adrenal cortex. So recall that the cortex, it makes corticosteroids. It's not the one that's stimulated by the nervous system. It's actually stimulated by the anterior pituitary. And corticosteroids are things such as cortisol and sex androgens, such as testosterone and estrogen. And what cortisol does is regulates your stress response. We're going to talk about that in part 4 of this week, but essentially preparing the body for a stress response, conserving energy where it's needed, maybe increasing your fight or flight while decreasing your rest and digest, something like that. So androgens, ultimately, this production here in the adrenals is quite complicated, but ultimately what happens is the androgens in the adrenal cortex lead to the ultimate production of testosterone and estrogen. And the gonads, the testes, and the ovaries produce the most testosterone and estrogen, but they are supplemented by the adrenal medulla. All right, so this one begins with gonadotropin releasing hormone. Gonads indicate your sex organs, so testes and ovaries. Gonadotropin releasing hormone is released by the hypothalamus, which targets the anterior pituitary, which then is stimulated to release LH and FSH, which is luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And males and females have both of these hormones. They do have a little bit different function, or more of a function in females than males, but they are necessary for both sexes. So LH in males promotes testosterone secretion, and in females, it actually promotes ovulation, but it also promotes the sex hormone secretion as well. So similar function, right? In males, you have more testosterone than estrogen and progesterone. In females, you have more estrogen and progesterone than testosterone. And then also triggering the ovulation point during the menstrual cycle. We'll get to that more when we get to reproductive system. FSH stimulates sperm production in males and stimulates the follicular growth in females. So very similar again, because in the follicle is a developing egg. And so you have to stimulate that follicular growth to mature that egg. And that's the sex cell of the female, and the sperm is the sex cell of the male. So similar functions. Usually women and other folks are more familiar with the role in females, but they do also have a role in males. We're going to talk about that this week when you do your case study. All right, that was all the anterior pituitary. Okay, so the anterior pituitary, what you noticed with all of those is we started with the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus of the brain stimulates the anterior pituitary. I need you to switch gears now, and we're going to talk about how the posterior pituitary is stimulated. So the hypothalamus detects a change in the environment, but it sends a nervous impulse down the axon into the posterior pituitary gland. And from there, the posterior pituitary will release its hormones in response to that nervous response. So remember, there was 3 different ways that hormones are released. One's by the hypothalamus, one's by the nervous system, and one's by the gland's own detecting of the environment, right? This one is actually falls under the nervous system criteria. So this one, the posterior pituitary is stimulated by the nervous system by an impulse started in the hypothalamus. So still kind of stimulated by the hypothalamus, but not stimulated by a hormone released from the hypothalamus. It's stimulated by a nerve impulse from the hypothalamus. All right, so there's only two hormones here in the posterior pituitary to be aware of. One is antidiuretic hormone, one is oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone, think of this as anti-urination hormone. Okay, so if you've all, maybe a lot of you at least, have heard of what diuretics are, and in the elderly people who have kidney problems or fluid retention issues, they maybe need to take a diuretic, which makes them have to go to the bathroom a lot. Well, ultimately, in a healthy human, right, antidiuretic hormone is released in response to low blood pressure. And I'm going to repeat this throughout the term multiple times. You're going to get so tired of hearing it. But essentially, low blood pressure is a result of low blood volume. And blood is comprised mainly of water, right? So that means you don't have a lot of water in your bloodstream. And so what's going to happen is your kidneys is going to retain sodium. So we talked about this in the last lecture where sodium is reabsorbed into the bloodstream. If sodium is reabsorbed into the bloodstream out of the urine, then water is going to follow, right? And if water follows, now you have a lot of water back in your bloodstream as well. And you're going to raise your blood volume, which is then going to raise your blood pressure. And that essentially decreases the amount you urinate, right? Because you're absorbing a lot of the sodium and water that would normally be in your urine, but your body's hanging on to that because it needs it. And so we're reabsorbing that back into the bloodstream. Antidiuretic, anti-urination. Okay. The other thing it targets is blood vessels, and that causes vasoconstriction, or if your blood vessels like this, it's going to make it go like this. What that does is naturally increases the resistance in that blood vessel, and that's going to increase your blood pressure as well. We're going to talk more about that when we get to the blood, vascular and cardiovascular systems. The other hormone that's released is oxytocin. Oxytocin is released in response to uterine stretching. So as your uterus stretches, there are stretch receptors in that muscle, and that causes gradually increasing oxytocin release until about, the magic 40-41 weeks, right? When labor is initiated. And so oxytocin is released then in response to when the uterus gets so far stretched and causes those muscles to contract and promote labor. The other thing that oxytocin does is promote milk ejection. So prolactin induced milk production, but how do you actually let down or release that milk? That's going to be oxytocin. Oxytocin, a lot of people think of it as like a happy hormone. And when the infant suckles on the nipple of the mother, that releases oxytocin from the posterior pituitary, and then that oxytocin is released, travels the bloodstream to the mammary glands, and then allows that milk to be ejected from the nipple. Pretty fascinating stuff. All right. So those are two areas we talked about, the anterior and the posterior pituitary and how they're controlled, right? So the anterior pituitary is controlled by the hypothalamus release of hormones to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release its own hormones. The posterior pituitary can technically be controlled by the hypothalamus, but not hypothalamic hormones, rather hypothalamic nerve impulses. And so the posterior pituitary is stimulated by the nervous system. Now, we have lots of other endocrine glands that we've labeled in lecture 1. And so we need to talk about all of those. These glands are going to be those kind of self-detecting glands, and they are not controlled by the hypothalamus. So let's talk about some of those here. The thyroid. So, and you're going to be confused because you're like, hold on, Becca, you just told us that the thyroid is stimulated by the anterior pituitary. It is, but there's one other hormone that is secreted by the thyroid that is not controlled by the anterior pituitary, and that is something called, there it is, calcitonin. I'm like, I didn't even write it on here. Calcitonin. Okay. So what the thyroid can do is sense the calcium levels in the bloodstream. Okay. So this thyroid gland is actually covered in little capillaries. And so the bloodstream carries calcium, and this thyroid can do its own little detective work and figure out what that level is. And if calcium levels too high, that stimulates this thyroid gland to release something called calcitonin. And what calcitonin does is targets the bone and the kidneys. And if we have too much calcium in the bloodstream, we need to take it out of the bloodstream and we need to store it somewhere else in the body, right? Just not in the bloodstream. And so places that it can store it is in bone tissue. So we can store it in bone tissue, kind of build bone material. Or the kidneys can get rid of some of it in your urine. Okay. As a result, we're now lowering the blood calcium back to normal. Negative feedback homeostasis, right? We're going to nail on that this whole week. All right, parathyroids. We haven't talked about these guys yet. The parathyroids are their own self-detectable area as well. And here they are, these little red beans back here. Those are the parathyroids sitting on the back of the thyroid gland. Here's some capillaries, arterioles that you can see here. Arterioles rather. And the parathyroid does the opposite of what the thyroid does in terms of calcium. And so the parathyroid then would be stimulated if the calcium levels were too low in the bloodstream. So thyroid responds when levels are too high. Parathyroid responds when levels are too low. And how it does that is releases something called PTH, or parathyroid hormone, or sometimes it's called parathormone as well. And so it's going to target the same areas, bone and kidneys. It also can target the intestines in this case. And we're just going to do the opposite of what we did if it was too high, right? So if we need more calcium in the bloodstream because it's too low, we need to go find it in places that we've stored it and bring it out and put it into the bloodstream, right? So bone, we have little cells that break down bone called osteoclasts if you took 215. So those little guys will break down some bone tissue. You won't even know you missed it. And that will release calcium into the bloodstream. Your kidneys can reabsorb more rather than put it into the urine. So your kidneys can reabsorb that out of the urine back into the bloodstream. Or you can absorb more calcium from the food that you're eating as well. Your digestive tract can do that. And in response, now you're raising the blood calcium back up to a normal level. Negative feedback, homeostasis, right? So here's a good example. So if we have decreased blood calcium, we are going to release PTH. PTH is released into the bloodstream, travels to bone, kidneys, digestive tract. So if we promote PTH here and it binds on cells in the bone, we're going to have calcium put into the bloodstream, kidneys, calcium put into the bloodstream. And then same with intestines. That actually goes through the kidneys, but I'm not going to go into all that. That gets a little complicated, but essentially your intestines are going to absorb calcium into the bloodstream as well. And then if you test the level of calcium in here, hopefully it's back up to normal. Now, once it gets back up to normal, right, you need to shut it off because otherwise now it's going to get too high, right? And then your thyroid's going to have to kick in and tell it to slow it down again. And that does happen. That's homeostasis. Remember how we talked about that fluctuating line of hormone in the body at all times, but there's this level that we kind of want to fluctuate around. Okay, that's going to happen again. So once that bloodstream gets back to a normal level, we send a message back to the parathyroid telling it to quit releasing PTH because we're good now, right? All right, adrenals. So we did talk about the adrenal cortex being stimulated by ACTH, and that releases cortisol. But something else that the cortex releases is something called aldosterone that is not controlled by the anterior pituitary and hypothalamus. And aldosterone has a role in responding to low sodium and high potassium in the blood plasma. Normally we want a higher sodium than we do potassium, right? 3 to 2. But let's say that our potassium is too high. So what's going to happen is this system called the renin-angiotensin system is going to be stimulated. And I'm not going to go into detail of the system super highly right now, because we're going to do it again when we get to the cardiovascular and urinary systems. So you're going to see this again. But essentially what aldosterone is going to do is tell the kidney to, through this really complicated system, right, that you don't need to know right now, okay? Aldosterone is going to tell the kidney to reabsorb the sodium that it's filtering out into the urine. And by reabsorbing that sodium, okay, you're going to have potassium go out into the urine because those two things need to balance each other. And then that will increase blood pressure. Now, why? Because what follows sodium? Water, right? So if we reabsorb sodium back into the bloodstream, water is going to follow. And then that increases blood volume, which increases blood pressure, right? You're going to hear me say that. I told you all the time, all term here. Okay, but what about the medulla, right? We haven't talked about the medulla. We've talked about the cortex, cortisol with ACTH and CRH, and we talked about it independently as aldosterone. But what about the medulla, this inside, right? Recall from the histology lecture, I said that the medulla is stimulated by nervous system, and there are some non-steroid hormones produced and released there, epinephrine, norepinephrine. And norepinephrine and epinephrine have very similar function, but epinephrine is more abundant. That's kind of like a T4, T3 scenario with the thyroid, where they have very similar function, but one's just more abundant. So the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight. Okay, so sympathetic nervous system tells your heart rate to increase, your blood pressure to increase, your respiratory rate to increase, your glucose mobilization to increase for energy during this time period, and shuts down basically anything to do with digestion and urination. Okay, we don't want to put energy into those things right now. We need to put all of our energy into our cardiovascular system in this time of stress. So when our sympathetic nervous system is stimulated, it comes down and stimulates the medulla and tells it to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, and that induces that fight or flight response. Okay, increasing the cardiovascular, the vitals, but decreasing anything that we don't need to be putting energy towards right now, which would be like digestion and urination. Pancreas. He's kind of cute, isn't he? My dissection students always make fun of me because whenever we find the pancreas, I think he's just the cutest little organ in the human cadavers, and they make fun of me, and they wouldn't let me hear the end of it this last year here, this last semester, this spring, and they're seniors, so they're gone now, but I'm gonna miss them for sure. Anyway, the pancreas. All right, endocrine function with the pancreas, because we are in the endocrine section. Remember, pancreas is also exocrine, but we're going to talk about that later. The pancreas auto-detects the levels of glucose in the bloodstream, and it responds to too much glucose or too little glucose. So let's just say you eat a meal, and after a meal, your blood glucose spikes, right? All those carbohydrates that you just ate are being broken down into their monomer of glucose. The pancreas senses that, and those little islets, which we know from histology now in the part 1 lecture, releases insulin, turns off or way down the glucagon. We're going to get to glucagon in a second, but we're going to increase insulin. And what insulin does is basically tells the cells to take that glucose out of the bloodstream because it's too much, store it in the liver. And the form of storage that glucose is stored in the liver as is something called glycogen. So if you think about, I don't know, it's a big chemistry thing, but I just always think about putting glucose into like a tote, like a packing tote, putting the lid on it, and now it's glycogen, right? It's not being used, it's stored away. Now, in times of fasting, right, when you're not eating meals, your blood glucose lowers. Well, why do most people not tank their blood sugar? I said most people, right? Why do most people not tank their blood sugar when they don't eat? Because their pancreas is well functioning, right? And so what their pancreas does is turn off or down the insulin, because that will only further lower your blood glucose, right? We want to turn up our glucagon secretion. Glucagon goes in to the liver, unpacks that glycogen, gets that glucose out, and puts it into the bloodstream for circulation. Okay. This concept here of the pancreas and blood sugar is one that if you retain nothing else from endocrine, I hope that you retain this. Very important, very important. Now people that are diabetic have a totally different story here, right? Some people need continuous blood sugar monitoring, continuous insulin, because they just don't make any, or are not sensitive to it anymore, right? But they're still producing glucagon, and so maybe their blood sugars get too high, things like that. So again, if your blood glucose is too high, insulin is released. If your blood glucose is too low, glucagon is released, and that's just to lower or raise your blood glucose back to homeostasis. The pineal gland, he sits right here. So just for reference, here's the hypothalamus with the pituitary. The pineal gland is way back here. So it's behind this area called the thalamus. If you haven't had 215, you will talk about the thalamus there, but the pineal sits back here right above the brainstem, and he is stimulated by light and dark cycles, his own kind of sensing of that, and secretes a substance called melatonin. And melatonin regulates your circadian rhythm. So it not only makes you sleepy, that is a function of melatonin, but it also just simply regulates circadian rhythm. And so if it's lighter out, right, you don't secrete as much melatonin, but if it's dark, then you will secrete melatonin. So that's really important when we talk about like people who are on their technology devices a lot at night. That blue light mimics the light of like daytime. And the more light that you're exposed to, the less you produce melatonin and the harder it is to fall asleep. So that's kind of a good clinical correlation there. The thymus gland is one that maybe not a lot of you have heard about, but it's regulated by various functions in terms of nervous system and endocrine function, but it's most active in young children and babies. So let's go over to the adult first. So it's here, kind of sits under the thyroid right behind the sternum. And in a baby, this is how big it is, right? And why would that be important? I want you to think about that for just a second. Hopefully you said because those children need to develop their immune system at a young age. And adults, we already have the majority of our immune system in place. And so we don't necessarily need it. It actually turns into like fatty adipose tissue in an adult. But essentially the thymus, if you remember from histology, releases a hormone that helps produce these T lymphocytes, which are a type of white blood cell. The hormone that does that is called thymosin. So this thymus gland will release thymosin and basically tell itself, autocrine, right? It's an autocrine mechanism to start producing and differentiating T lymphocytes into T cells and B cells for immunity. We'll talk more about that when we get to the lymphatic system. And testes and ovaries here. So we did talk about estrogen and testosterone being released by not only the adrenal cortex, but estrogen and testosterone are also released in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone, FSH and LH, right? So remember that one function of FSH and LH in both sexes was to promote the production of sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen. But what do those hormones do, right? So testosterone is responsible for promoting sperm maturation and aids in libido. And then estrogen and progesterone are busy getting that uterus ready for pregnancy, potentially. Interestingly enough, and I want you to keep this in mind for the case study this week, these glands also secrete something called inhibin. And inhibin is released by the ovaries and testes in response to a lot of FSH and therefore testosterone and estrogen secretion. And what it'll do then is it'll tell the FSH or the anterior pituitary to shut off the FSH for a while, right? So you can imagine that if your estrogen and progesterone levels are high because you're pregnant, there's no need to mature more follicles and eggs for ovulation, right? You don't have a period when you're pregnant, you're not ovulating when you're pregnant. And so inhibin, when estrogen and progesterone levels are high, inhibin is released to tell the anterior pituitary to save it. We don't need your FSH right now, not for 9 more months, right? And that's a negative feedback mechanism. Okay, if something's high, then it shuts something else off. That's kind of the idea here. So I want you to keep that in mind. That leads into this recap. So in the last lecture, I had talked about steroids in like bodybuilders, like people who take anabolic steroids. Testosterone is a very common one of those. And I want you to think about how would injecting, now that you know what you know from this lecture, how would injecting high levels of testosterone affect your negative feedback mechanism? So I gave you an example in the female in the last slide. I want you to think about this for the male. Okay. I'm not going to tell you the answer right now because this also comes into play in the case study this week, that discussion. And so I'm going to leave that up to you, and I will come back to that after the case studies are due. All right, so that is part 3 for this week. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you at part 4.